Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by Compliance Week. I'm Joe McCafferty, Executive Editor of Compliance Week, and I'll be hosting this afternoon's webcast. Today we're going to be talking about developing an effective risk and compliance management program. Before we hear from our guests, let me quickly go over the agenda for this afternoon. We're scheduled to go for an hour. I'll give a brief introduction and then we'll jump into the presentation, brought to you along with IBM. The presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. Your questions will be confidential, so don't be shy. You can ask your question at any time by using the Ask a Question function that's on the left-hand side of your screen. I'll pose the questions to our guests at the end of the presentation, but you can ask your question at any time. I urge you to ask them as they occur to you. This webcast will also offer CPE credits for all attendees. To obtain your CPE credit, wait until the webcast is over and I sign off. And at that point, the final exam will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have any trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, just send an email to info@complianceweek.com to request a copy. A couple other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, you can download the slides from the drop-down menu. That's on the left-hand side of your screen. You can also hit the View Slide Full Screen button that's at the bottom of your screen to increase the size of the slides. Lastly, a Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. Today's webcast is part of a series that we launched a few years ago. We hold these webcasts just about every week, usually on Thursdays. Our guests have been chief compliance and governance officers at leading public companies and experts on various compliance, regulatory, governance, and risk topics. For an upcoming schedule of our webcasts, please visit our website, www.complianceweek.com, for details or to register for those. And also, if you missed our Conflicts Minerals webcast forum that we held in February, those webcasts are now available on our on-demand for a limited time. In addition, don't forget, of course, to register for our upcoming annual conference. That's being held May 19th to the 21st in Washington, D.C. Spots are filling up for that, so I encourage you to register for that if you're interested. Let's begin our program. Very happy to have with us Richard Steinberg. He's founder and CEO of Steinberg Governance Advisors, which he is an internationally recognized expert on governance, risk management, and compliance. He advises boards of directors of major multinational, large, and middle market companies on board responsibilities and governance best practices, and senior managements on governance, risk management, control, and compliance. Rick was formerly a senior partner in the governance practice leader at PwC, and Rick is also a monthly columnist for Compliance Week. We also have with us John Kelly. He's a worldwide market segment manager for risk analytics at IBM. John is responsible for the definition and orchestration of go-to-market strategies and marketing's overall impact to IBM's risk analytics business. John is a frequent speaker at risk industry events and has been active in risk and compliance management since 2008, brings more than 15 years of experience in enterprise management software. Very pleased to have both of you with us. Rick, do you want to get us started?
I'll be happy to. Thank you, Joe, for that kind introduction. In the time we have available, I'd like to talk about the relevance of culture in large organizations, how changing or attempts to change a culture can be like turning a battleship. Doesn't have to be, but often is. What works and what doesn't in terms of effective risk management and compliance processes, and then steps that can be taken moving forward to effect those processes. Okay, we'll start with culture. And as most of you know, I'm sure, culture is amorphous. It's intangible, but at the same time, it generally reflects and is in a company's DNA. It affects everything a company does, from strategic decisions, infrastructure, and the other points on this slide. It builds up over time, and often changing a culture can be like turning around a battleship, and we'll talk about that in some cases starting right now. We can learn from the engineering giant Siemens and what happened to it. As I'm sure you know, they encountered several years ago a huge bribery scandal. They paid over $2 billion in fines. Two executives, by the way, are going to be paying another $1.5 million. They have a deep history, not a proud one, of paying bribes. It's ingrained in their culture, and it started after World War II, and that continued to change, actually, even after the law changed in 1999. In its culture, and this is telling and an important issue, bribery was not only acceptable, it was encouraged at the highest levels. They paid over $1.3 billion in bribes. They had local consultants, and what the regulators say is very, very telling. The bribery was systematic, widespread, egregious, brazen, massive, willful, and carefully orchestrated. Moving over to auto manufacturer Daimler, they paid hundreds of bribes to officials. 22 countries over 10 years, they had cash desks. Not only in middle management, but heads of overseas sales divisions were directly involved in the bribery. And the Department of Justice here, too, made some important points, saying it was the culture that tolerated this. It encouraged bribery. And there was lack of central oversight. We have more, unfortunately. The big bank, UBS, we know of the secret accounts. We know it was an unregistered broker-dealer, investment advisor here in the U.S., the bid rigging, auction rate security settlement. And here, this is amazing to me. They are reported to have paid over $22 billion in reimbursements to clients for its actions. They are involved in the LIBOR scandal. They've paid $1.5 billion already. And what the regulator said here, the managers not only knew what was going on, they participated and drove this behavior. A pharmaceutical, Amgen, they illegally marketed their anemia drug, and that was even after the FDA made it clear to them that that drug was not approved for such usage. The activities reportedly were widespread, known by the managers, and indeed in one training program, a manager said something to the effect, she boasted about a $10,000 grant to one doctor and said, "I hope no one is taping this." Well, indeed, that information was captured. There is a long-time sales rep at Amgen who made a very telling point. She said, Amgen had good science, products, and strong ethics until new management arrived, and that's when the culture changed. And when that happened, it became more important to make the numbers than to follow the rules. HSBC, another example. They are accused of letting Mexican drug cartels, Saudi Arabian banks, Iranians, all use the bank as a money laundering machine. Here's something you'll find fascinating, I'm sure, as I did. They reportedly gave their lowest risk rating to Mexico in spite of what we all know, that Mexico is extraordinarily high risk for drug trafficking and money laundering. This was a recurrence of other past events. And here a U.S. Senate report, again, and we're focusing on culture at this point, said the bank's culture was pervasively polluted. And there are many investigations going on at this point. This rogues gallery, as I'm calling it, there are many, many more. Here are just a couple or a few more examples. Washington Mutual had the ninja loans, selling off the CDOs to Fannie and Freddie and others. Countrywide is very similar. News of the World had the phone hacking where Rupert Murdoch said that you bury your mistakes here in this organization. That was telling. Walmart, of course, had the bribes to Mexican officials to open stores in that country. And when the top executives of that company found out, what did they do? Did they proceed with the investigation? No, they in fact shut it down completely. Tyson's Foods is interesting. There was a memo from a plant manager that came upstream in the organization saying that there are payments to veterinarians' wives to certify the food as sound. What did top management do when it got that memo? It said we should stop paying the veterinarians' wives. Did they say stop the payments entirely? No. They said let's pay the veterinarians directly. In Avon, there are bribes to Chinese officials. What did management do? It hid the report from the board of directors. Point is, the tone at the top, driving culture, permeates the organization and affects everything that is done. Well, there are some companies that have succeeded in turning around the so-called battleship, and we'll talk about a few of those. At Siemens, they had a new chief executive, a new general counsel, a new head of professional practices, it's called. I talked to that individual at length, by the way, and shared an awful lot in terms of what happened there. There's a new strategic direction. What's very interesting is they replaced not only 80% of the top-level executives, but also 70% of the next level and 40% of the level after that. They had an amnesty program saying that if you, as an employee, come forward now and tell us what happened, there's no problem, you're fine. But if you don't and we find out you're involved, you're history. There are new controls, new approval processes, new compliance and audit functions, new investigation protocols, not underreacting or overreacting, extensive training, and the focus, importantly, on the tone in the middle. We talk about the culture of the organization, and that goes down throughout the organization, and they wanted to see if the behavior in the middle and downstream was consistent with the messages coming from the chief executive officer and the chief compliance officer. They also engaged the Transparency International founder to help with this transition, and he said there was indeed a sea change. New processes, people, procedures. He said, but there will be no difference in the organization unless there's a change in the culture, and indeed everything indicates that that did happen. The new general counsel makes the point healthy compliance cultures depend on values-based leadership, where people don't need to look at the rule. They know intuitively what the right thing to do is. They did change the culture, and interestingly and importantly, he said now when foreign officials ask for money, the answer is no. But Siemens usually gets the work anyway. It's had record market share and record profitability since this happened. Going to Daimler, a similar situation, and they acknowledged the wrongdoing, cooperated with regulators. They strengthened their controls and procedures. They accepted a monitor to oversee and evaluate the ethics and compliance programs of the organization. They appointed a former judge to a new position for integrity and legal affairs. And here's an important issue, and it sounds crass, but there's a saying that's tossed around that sometimes you have to throw a body on the fire. I apologize for that. When the head of the company's U.S. operations was found to have used funds for personal use, and he didn't fess up to it, he was immediately fired in spite of his stellar performance. And what did that do? That sent a clear message throughout the worldwide organization that lack of integrity will be dealt with severely regardless of who you are. Okay, let's take a look at what does work and what doesn't work. And we'll start with really what doesn't work. And a number of companies I've worked with, when they've had a problem, the first thought of the chief executive is, why don't we get our PR people in here and take care of it? And PR by itself certainly won't work, and even getting the PR right is difficult. The CEO of the bank, of UBS, said, in quotes, "We discovered behavior of certain employees, that is unacceptable. This certainly does not acknowledge the widespread nature of the failures, and it certainly doesn't accept blame by the bank as an institution." Amgen's chief compliance officer. The quote is here, "The government raised important concerns. Amgen acknowledges that mistakes were made." I love that phrase. "And we did not live up to our standards." Mistakes were made doesn't say that we made mistakes and we're going to do something about it. And raised important concerns certainly does not come close to acknowledging the state of illegality. There are two large companies I dealt with where the CEOs really drove not a positive but indeed a negative culture. One is a financial services company, and this CEO had all the trappings of an Egyptian king. I could go into detail, but time doesn't permit it. But he certainly had all the perks: multiple residences, wardrobes, use of private jets, etc. He did grow the business, but his strong-arm tactics turned off management, and his side deals demonstrated favoritism, and that caused tremendous infighting. He was finally found to be inappropriate for the organization, and he was moved out. Technology company. This CEO controlled the board. He was actually a founder of this company. He handpicked the board, set the agenda, sent out masses of information so they couldn't possibly absorb it, made strategic decisions by himself. There are no performance objectives, certainly no succession plan. He was a bully. And he, frankly, on the side, he tried to bully me. That didn't work. But it didn't work in the organization either. And even though he drove growth, he finally had major problems, and he was tossed out by the board. A couple of things that, just briefly, there are actions from CEOs that can be very helpful, and they deal generally with dealing with people. And if you just take a look at the Delta Airlines CEO, leadership, everything you do is an example. People take a signal from everything you do, and the Ford CEO, you need to understand why people thought what they did, why they did what they did, what worked for them, what didn't. What they're saying is they interact with the people in the organization, understand them, they're approachable, there's communication, and that helps to drive the culture through the organization. Excuse me, I did that the wrong way. Okay. I want to go back. I might have. I guess we're doing okay. I changed the slide mechanically rather than on this. Okay, so let's go to. I apologize. What helps in terms of considering what needs to be done when an event happens, when a compliance failure occurs? What is very important to ask yourself is, were these risks that came about really on the company's radar screen in advance? Did senior executives really think about in advance the consequences of this kind of a scandal? What was the tone at the top? What was the culture? What risk management and compliance processes were there in advance? When the results became known, what did management do, and what was done when the results became public? Now, there are some instances where a company can change the culture, and we have some examples of where it did turn around very quickly, almost like turning a speedboat. I dealt with all three of these companies. An insurance company, large one, had a scandal over improper sales practices, and the CEO learned, among a number of things, that the call center personnel needed to get licenses as soon as possible in order to stay on a commission system, or they needed to be licensed. He said, let's get them as soon as possible, and found out that sent the wrong message, basically saying it's okay to break the law temporarily. He straightened out that message and said, these personnel will stay on straight salary until they are licensed, and that sent the right message throughout. Professional services firm, there was a female manager who was not promoted over a couple of years. The problem turned out to be the unit leader, who was very successful in driving growth in that unit. The CEO got his direct reports around him and asked, what is the right thing to do? The answer came out to be promote the manager and move that leader out of the position. That's exactly what happened, and that became known throughout the organization in a hurry. Computer Products Company, it's a tobacco company actually, that wanted to install a risk management process, but the senior managers really didn't want to accept that because they had a tough guy image. They didn't want to acknowledge risk at all. What happened was the CEO decided to institute the program at the very top of the organization in strategic planning and budgeting with his direct reports, and that then ultimately cascaded down the organization, and it quickly became known it's acceptable to acknowledge and deal with risk. Moving forward, it's insightful, I think, to gain some information from Department of Justice. We don't certainly view them as setting standards, but their perspective can be helpful. And the DOJ looks at, makes enforcement decisions based on these factors: the nature and seriousness of the offense, pervasiveness in wrongdoing, and management complicity, any history of such misconduct, and the adequacy of the compliance program that was existing before this problem occurred. The DOJ officials fairly recently spoke about these factors. They said, look, there's a common denominator that when there's misconduct, it's typically failure by senior management to foster an ethical culture. Saying that the conduct was shameful and contrary to core values is too little and too late for the DOJ. It does nothing for them. They find that the tone in the middle is as, if not more important than at the top, and they look hard at the messages actually sent and indeed received. Supervisors value coming close to the line. This is a problem that they identify, and when risk-taking is incentivized, excessive risk-taking, what often happens is the people who do that leave the organization and someone else needs to clean up the mess. Well, that was an issue, of course, in a number of the banks, the large banks. I'd like to take a moment and talk about another regulator. Yes, it's a regulator, but the SEC's Office of Compliance Investigations and Examination, and that was headed by Carlo DeFlorio. I spoke with him at length about this. And he has a 10-point program, which really is, I think, quite interesting and, frankly, quite good in terms of highlighting what's necessary for a good compliance program. And here are the points. I'm not going to read them all, but certainly the board and senior management, more the senior management, has to set the tone. Ethics programs need the resources and authority. The culture needs to be there across the organization with accountability. There need to be the right incentives. Risk management processes need to be in place throughout the enterprise. You need the policies and procedures tailored appropriately. And the last 5 are communication and training tailored, needs to be monitored and upwards reporting, escalation, investigation, and discipline when there are problems. Issues management. There need to be root cause analysis of what happened, what went wrong, and how it needs to be fixed. and ongoing improvement. So I think that's a good place to look to for an overview of what a good compliance process entails. And frankly, I worked with Carlo in a prior life, and his thinking and mine are quite similar. These are the elements, the pieces of a good risk management program on the left and a good compliance program on the right. There's nothing earth-shaking here. You all know about this, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But what I am going to do is focus on what needs to go along with those elements. And what leading companies do, they align risk management and compliance processes with their business objectives. They start with the business objectives and deal with compliance and risks stemming from them. Therefore, risk management and compliance is built into the business. Business units are intimately involved. And responsibility rests not with a CCO or CRO, but rather with the line and staff managers. The takeaway point is this, and I'd like to emphasize this if I may. If risk and compliance is superimposed on top of what you already have, the cost will be astronomical, probably unbearable. When it's built into the business, there's greater efficiency, effectiveness, and compliance, and that's what works. Like to take a moment on what can be called collaborative risk management. You might have the opposite, where there's one risk manager overworked, exhaustive risk registers. That's different from a culture that rewards risk ownership, which is built into the business with owners and teams and so forth. Not by one employee, by many teams. And what you don't want is Dr. No, where every opportunity, the answer you get from risk management is no. Got to understand the way to get to a positive answer wherever possible. So effective risk management incorporates the positive opportunities and the cost of not acting. ERM is as much about achieving success as avoiding failure. And once initiated, risk managers don't want to be stuck at the register level identifying risk. You want 80% of the effort not on identification and assessment, which is very common, but rather most of it on how to manage that risk. So those are some of the distinctions between a collaborative and non-collaborative risk management focus. Some key elements, and where we can almost summarize a lot of what we're saying with this slide. CEO behavior, setting the culture is critical. Sending the right message and making sure those messages are received downstream. Knowing what's going on, it's hard to overemphasize this. This is part of the management process. The CEO, his or her direct reports, and all the way going downstream, managers need to know what's really going on in the organization, how things are really being done, and that's management incorporating compliance and risk within it. Along with open channels of communication, they're supplemented by ombudsmen and a whistleblower process, and we could spend hours on that alone. I think most of you know what that is and how it needs to work effectively. You need a focused compliance office, an internal audit function, and risk management office as well. And what's really helpful to enable management and indeed the board to confirm what they think is going on throughout the organization is what is called a risk culture survey, and doing that over time and seeing trends in the results. Here's a quote, not from a famous person. It's something actually I wrote, and I apologize for that, for showing it here, but I think it's important. I'd like to end with this. If management doesn't take the necessary action to do two things, to ensure it knows how business is being conducted throughout the organization, and two, the tone at the top permeates the organization to form a desired culture, then pressures and temptations will result in misconduct. It's not a question of whether it will occur, but rather when and to what extent and the scope of damage, and whether a cancer will grow to a point where neither drugs nor surgeries will be able to stop it. I'd like now, and thank you for your attention, I'd like to turn this over to my esteemed colleague, John Kelly, who will take it from here.
Thank you, Rick. I'll spend just a few minutes speaking to how some of our IBM OpenPages customers have implemented a programmatic approach to managing compliance and regulatory change. And I'll speak to the process for communicating and tracking and monitoring policy changes associated with new and changed regulations so that your employees are aware and understand how the regulatory changes affect their business practices. And as Rick pointed out, the risk of non-compliance can significantly impact reputation, and making penalties in some cases seem trivial. So let's take a look at a recent survey from the Risk Management Association, the RMA. They found that reputation risk exposure was ranked the largest threat to a bank's business. And as Rick discussed, we've seen numerous high-level scandals, and really the numbers are growing. And some have resulted from poor controls or the ability for traders to sidestep internal controls. Others have been the result of data and IT breaches. So strong controls, assessments, and policy management aligned to the business objectives, as Rick mentioned, are critical to reducing control failures and compliance risk. But that has become increasingly difficult as of late for several reasons. Firstly, a very dynamic environment that organizations are competing in, which impacts their ability to manage reputation risk. As you can see here, new business models and technologies such as BYOD, cloud and SaaS offerings, the distributed global workforce have all really helped to increase the threat and the number of incidents of cybersecurity. Now, I was reading yesterday that over the past 12 days, more than 12.5 billion records have been breached at 13 organizations around the globe. So that's just in the past week and a half. So compliance and evolving regulations, as well as best practice guidelines such as COBIT, ITIL, ISO, have never been more important to a business. And an effective compliance management program is a very integral part of improving business performance and really driving value from your risk and compliance office. So risk and compliance, I would argue, is no longer viewed as a cost center, but actually providing strategic value to the business. Business leaders are looking to leverage these programs to make better decisions and for those investments to help drive profitable growth. An effective compliance program, though, can also deliver significant returns on investments, as we see in this example of a leading financial services institution where a director was bribing a foreign government official for his own financial gain. And when this scandal first surfaced internally, the executives contacted the Department of Justice and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to make them aware of the situation and then conducted a thorough investigation. So it turns out the DOJ and the SEC decided not to bring any enforcement action because this company, this financial services company, was able to prove that they had maintained relevant internal controls, that they were regularly updating the controls to reflect other risks of misconduct. They had done extensive training to their personnel with monitoring, and that they had conducted a timely reporting and a very thorough investigation. So they came to the DOJ, SEC, and because of this upfrontedness and the ability to prove that they had a very effective compliance program, there were no fines or penalties applied to this company. So now if you compare this to the numerous examples that Rick mentioned of fraud and trading scandals at global banks, which have really tarnished their reputation and provided concrete evidence that these banks were not managing their operations as effectively as most shareholders would demand, it's really quite revealing. So compliance is not just about meeting the requirements of external mandates, but also involves alignment and control to stay within the company's voluntary boundaries of ethics and values and code of conduct and really the culture of risk-taking and management. On the other hand, if you think about reputation and brand protection is a significant compliance and risk management issue, and so think about whether you'd be more likely to do business with a company that demonstrates effective risk management compliance programs versus one that is consistently in the news for scandals. So what are some of the challenges that our customers are facing as today's very highly regulated business environment continues to grow in complexity and the number of external and internal drivers increase? There are 4 key challenges that we see the compliance team focused on. And that is certainly demonstrating compliance to the board of directors and the regulators is number 1. But then, more importantly, managing through the regulatory change, managing the regulatory exams, the audits, and the requests that can sometimes be very redundant. And then lastly, because of all this, trying to reduce the cost and complexity of regulatory compliance. So what do they come to? When they come to us, they're asking us, what laws and regulations are applicable to my business? Where are the greatest areas of compliance exposure? Where do we have gaps in compliance? What is the business impact of not complying? And then do our policies cover all the necessary laws and regulations, and do they align with our corporate objectives? So from an internal compliance program perspective, compliance teams are faced with managing multiple compliance programs across the enterprise, and each compliance program has its own method and models around creating and communicating policies, providing evidence of compliance, and tracking noncompliance, as well as monitoring regulatory change. So what I'd like to do next is propose a few best practices that we've identified through working with our compliance customers and for you to consider. First, it's critical to maintain a central repository of laws, regulations, and industry best practices and standards that is shared across compliance groups, as this will provide a foundation for centrally tracking regulatory change and for mapping policies to requirements. And it also can facilitate what we call risk-based scoping of the policies and control infrastructure so that you can align policies and business objectives, as Richard pointed out. As you'll see in this example, a policy library helps you to map policies to regulations and also identify areas of overlap where multiple requirements can be satisfied by a single policy and control, and thereby reducing those redundant risk assessments and control tests, or what we often hear as assessment fatigue. Secondly, recommend putting together a framework that allows you to monitor that appropriate activities have been implemented as a result of regulatory change in the required timeframes, and that really ensures that an organization is compliant with the latest version of regulations to which they are subject. As you know, each new law or regulation brings new policies and procedures that are not integrated with others, so there can be a hugely duplicative cost and effort. Whereas a programmatic approach to regulatory change can help reduce regulatory risk by systematically communicating regulatory changes and then driving internal change processes throughout the organization and then monitoring the progress. Here's an example of a process flow to see how technology can be used to automate those steps. As you see, when an event happens, such as when a change in the law occurs or a new regulation is introduced, a regulatory alert comes in through the compliance team and is entered into the system with all the relevant information. The compliance manager and their team then uses that information and uses the system to notify all the applicable line of business or functional owners, the stakeholders that are affected by this change in the regulation and the policy and that need to be aware of it. And since the library of laws and regulations are already being managed in the system and already mapped to the applicable business entities, that's already in the system and can be leveraged for that process. Thirdly, a formal policy management framework is required. To be effective, organizations need to have the ability to clearly articulate the requirements to business units, to have transparency into the areas of risk, and to provide a methodology for monitoring the level of compliance. Now, regulators, when they come in, when they're doing their exams, they're looking at policies as a key mechanism for ensuring organizations are operating in an appropriate manner and in compliance with laws and regulations. So a policy management framework allows users to interact with policies in a narrative form consistent to how they're used to working, such as with Word or HTML, and to automate and review approval processes. And of course, it also helps to formalize the communication awareness and training programs. In this example, we've created a dashboard to help, to help compliance executives or regulators or auditors to review the status of policy revisions, awareness, and control effectiveness. Next, establishing monitoring controls with clear responsibilities and accountability among the compliance office and the internal audit. You need to implement a variety of monitoring activities at different levels in the organization to achieve that total picture of compliance. And this results in an effective monitoring and testing program, which includes questionnaires to confirm business units are operating in accordance with requirements and policies, control test monitoring, compliance metrics and key indicators at the line of business level to monitor compliance and measure business performance, and then capture and track compliance incidents, the root causes investigation and enforcement actions. Again, a dashboard can be created to allow executives to monitor that compliance, those metrics such as regulatory fines, incidents, customer complaints, code of conduct violations, and regulator inquiries. Now, with respect to regulator inquiries, a programmatic approach can help automate regulator interactions progress to gain efficiencies and utilize those results and metrics to monitor the overall compliance program, so that, ultimately the goal is passing that regulatory exam. So having a programmatic approach to a regulator inquiry can help you achieve that compliance approval. So this should be part of a compliance program, regulator interaction, and it should leverage an integrated platform with regulatory compliance management, with policy management, and regulatory management and key metrics. Now here you can see we've set up a regulator scorecard, which in this case is tracking exams and filings with the Fed and the SEC, as well as exam status, regulatory issues and fines. So you can real quickly view which exams are on track, which are behind and overdue, as well as where the issues are. Lastly, you'll want to consider a solution with integrated compliance reporting, as clear, timely reporting to top management and board of directors is critical and enables a holistic understanding of compliance programs and compliance risk from multiple perspectives. Executives need visibility into areas of noncompliance, as well as early exposure to potential gaps and to the impact to the business. So with an integrated risk reporting platform, businesses are able to see a range of risk information across different domains. You can see here your key risks, their current status, the trend over time, critical issues associated with those risks, and just a quick example of the different kinds of information that can be pulled together for a quick view. So the IBM OpenPages PCM, or Policy and Compliance Management module, is a single integrated solution to manage all those aspects of an effective compliance program, as you can see outlined here. TCM is a fully integrated module of the IBM OpenPages GRC Platform, which enables customers to manage risk and compliance initiatives across the enterprise, as well as to make those risk-aware decisions to help drive value. So I hope you'll find this discussion helpful. I'll now hand it back to Joe for questions.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thanks to both of you for a very insightful presentation here. Again, that was Richard Steinberg, founder and CEO of Steinberg Governance Advisors, and John Kelly, Worldwide Market Segment Manager for Risk Analytics. We get a lot of questions about the slides, so I want to make sure that you can download those. If you want to download a copy of the slides, use the drop-down menu that should be on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Let's move to some of your questions. Rick, we have a very good question here about board responsibility, and I know that's an area you've done a lot of work in. You mentioned an instance where an internal report on bribery was kept from the company's board of directors. Can you talk a little bit about the board's responsibility for risk management and compliance? What's their role in all of this?
Okay, sure, Joe. I've dealt with many boards, and this issue certainly comes up. And I ask what the board is doing, and the response often is we get from management the top 5 risks, the top 10 risks. They tell us in depth how they're managing them, and unfortunately, that's really a very small part of what the board's responsibilities are. The board needs to make certain that management has in place an effective process to identify relevant risks, to analyze them, and then to manage them. Reporting to the board is important, but unless the board is comfortable that management has that process in place to identify the risks, they have no idea whether management is bringing the most relevant risks to the board table. With compliance, it's similar. They need to make sure that management has an effective compliance process. And we talked about the elements of those processes, and the board needs to be comfortable and ask enough questions and push and probe and receive enough information until it's comfortable that those processes are in place. And then it may also get the top 10 risks and top 10 compliance issues and what's happening, and that is fine as well.
We have another good question here. It's somewhat related. Kind of at a very high level, what's your view of risk management's purpose within an organization? How would you characterize that? What's the goal of risk management overall?
Okay, John, I'll take this, or do you want it?
Go ahead. I can add a bit if you like.
Okay.
Yeah, Rick, why don't you start, and then John, if you could jump in and make some points as well.
Great. The real purpose, and this cuts through all the verbiage, the real purpose of a risk management process, an effective one, is to help line managers make better business decisions. If they have the right information on what the risks are, they'll be better able to accept opportunities. There's a long time saying that it's like a race car. The bigger the brakes, the faster it can go. Well, it's the same with risk management. You need to know what the downsides are, what can go wrong, in order to be able to manage those risks and move forward with major initiatives. So as an overall summary, that's what the purpose of risk management is.
Rick, I just want to poke on that a little bit. I think that's a very interesting observation, because I think a lot of, we usually see that risk management is more of the parent waving a finger, the Department of No, we sometimes hear. But your view is a little different than that. You really think that they can enable business. Tell us a little more about that. How are those two views different, I guess?
Sure. There is something called a risk appetite that management needs to bring to the board needs to approve in terms of how much risk is management allowed to take on. Are they prepared to bet the ranch or something less? And then going downstream, there are risk tolerances, which means with various initiatives, business lines, objectives, how much risk can be accepted at that level. So sure, there is some element of saying no to certain things, but the objective is to really grow the business and improve profitability and accept and relish those opportunities that are there in a managed, knowledgeable way.
John, jump in here. Can risk management really partner with the business?
Well, absolutely. I would not a whole lot more to add. I think we covered it very well, but I think it's not about mitigating risk. It's about managing risk for profit, for financial gain, for growth. So really, in many ways, risk management is performance management. And so when you have your key performance indicators, they really need to have an element of key risk indicators, because it's great to have these great goals, objectives, but if you don't understand the risk with achieving those and the trends involved in how your key risk indicators are potentially affecting your performance down the road, then you're not really seeing the full picture. So I do think that risk plays a huge role in the business performance, and needs to be managed effectively so that you can hit your profitability goals.
I see. And John, you've given me a great segue here into our next question. When you talk about seeing the business, a question here is what's the best way for senior management to know what's really going on throughout the organization, to know what the mindset is regarding risk and compliance? Rick, I'm going to turn to you on this. It's about measuring, right? How do we get a lot of questions about how do you measure things like risk management awareness or compliance awareness?
Sure, and I'll let John deal with this in the context of the software solutions that OpenPages IBM brings. I'd like to attack it in a different way. From a broad level, management needs to manage. I know that sounds profound, but managers need to know what their direct reports are doing, what risks they're identifying, how they're being analyzed and addressed. And they also need to know what is going on downstream in the organization. And I talked about a risk culture survey to supplement what managers already know in doing their jobs. That risk culture survey done over time to get trend lines is extremely important. But I know John can talk more about this.
Well, I don't know if I can jump back on the slides, but if you're looking at this integrated risk reporting slide, we have many customers that use these type of executive level dashboards for monthly or quarterly reviews with their senior teams or their board of directors. So it's really, how can we, from a quick visual, understand where the key areas are, what the trends are, and then have that drill down ability to understand what are the control failures or where are the risk assessments falling down. So, from a technology perspective, having that enterprise view into your risk exposure and your risk performance, your control performance is critical to helping businesses understand where they're exposed.
All right, let's take another question here. A very interesting question here. It's about a large company that doesn't currently have a chief compliance officer. There doesn't appear to be real ownership of compliance governance. The person is asking, how can I recommend this to make it happen? How do you get buy-in? How do you change that a situation like that? And I'll just whoever wants to jump in here.
Well, I would assume they must not be publicly traded then if they don't have any programs in place. But certainly we see. So OpenPages got its start as a Sarbanes-Oxley financial controls management vendor, and we see that even since that regulation has been eased up a little bit in North America, in the U.S., that we still have private companies that come to us, whether it's around SOX or whether it's around operational risk, because they want to manage their business better. So they're coming to us not because of a regulation, not because of compliance mandates, but because the want to do to manage their business effectively. So certainly I think that's something that has to come down from the top.
Rick, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think everything John said is, of course, on target. It's a challenge. If you don't have a compliance process and you don't have and are not in a position to be in senior management, then it's tough. It's very hard to ask management to devote resources to something that is seen or might be seen as simply a cost center with no benefit to the bottom line. Of course, if they understand the risks of noncompliance and what can happen to the reputation and economics of the organization, that's a good start if you can make that point. I think also if management can better understand that being a company that operates with a kind of culture of ethics and integrity, that company will typically attract the best customers, the best suppliers, the best alliance partners. Companies want to do business with organizations that show honesty and integrity. So that might be a way to help to slant the discussion to see if there's some opportunity to gain support for this.
Mm-hmm. And Rick, there's a question along these lines that I think is a very interesting one that I wanted to get to on the topic of culture, and you addressed this a little bit in your talk. Of course, culture is important, but the question says that by the time you've identified that there's a lack of culture, is it reasonable, to develop or begin overhauling the culture to an effective one, and how long could that take? The questioner seems to be suggesting that by the time you realize you don't have the right culture, perhaps the herd has left the barn, so to speak.
Right, and that's why it's extremely important for management to know what's going on throughout the organization. And also I mentioned doing a risk culture survey over time. Every 6 months is a good time frame to see what the culture really is, because those answers are anonymous and people are very free to say what's on their mind in those things. Turning the culture around...
Can I interrupt you, Rick, just
Sure.
to suggest something? Usually a difficult culture, I think we all agree that culture really does come from the top. Is it possible that that senior management doesn't realize that they have problems in the culture area if they're the ones that are most likely kind of driving it?
It's not only possible, Joe, it's common. The organizations I deal with, management and the board, believe there's a certain culture in the organization, and when we probe a little bit, we find that that's the furthest thing from the case. So you're absolutely right on. That can be a strong disconnect. And until management understands what is really going on, there's no initiative or motivation to try to change things. Now, once they have that, then they can change it through messaging, through management processes, through the kinds of actions. I touched on a few. I apologize for the term, but you sometimes have to throw a body on the fire. You have to make examples to make it clear that management is serious about what it wants to achieve in terms of changing a culture. It might be turning a battleship, or it might be turning a speedboat, depending on the circumstances.
We have just a couple minutes here. I'm just going to ask both of you to kind of take a look forward. There's been, a very rapid regulatory pace. I think, there's a couple questions here that we didn't get to, but I think we might be able to kind of address it in one swoop, where there seems to almost be regulatory fatigue. And I think a lot of companies and compliance executives feel like they have a difficult time keeping up with all the changes and the pace of regulatory change. Just looking out, can we expect that to slow down at any time? Dodd-Frank has been around for a while. It's starting to end, I think, along the horizon somewhere. But I never really hear anyone say that they think the pace of regulatory change is going to slow down. What's your take on that? First, Rick, and then we'll end with John here.
Okay. No, I don't see any slowdown in the pace. If there's one message I would like to leave this webcast with, it would be this in that regard, in answering that question. If you have taken the time and effort and designed and implemented an effective compliance program, you should be in good shape with respect to staying in compliance, and if you're not, in dealing with regulators when they come knocking on the door and showing their badges, in some cases flashing their guns. You'll be in good shape because you already have a pre-existing effective program, effective being the key word.
I'll just build on that. There's a survey that Gartner did of top 102 CEOs with respect to risk and compliance, their top priorities. Number one was regulatory change, which was separate and ahead of compliance. So these CEOs feel like they have a compliance department, a compliance function that is effective, but managing the regulatory change is their number one priority. So having an ability to keep up with change, to be able to create and update policies and communicate those changes is number one. The second thing is they're really, I think, with respect to Dodd-Frank in particular, they're really moving from rulemaking to more supervision. And so what we're seeing that the regulators are getting a lot more interested in the data quality. So not just have you shown evidence of compliance, but really drilling down and trying to understand where that data came from, and is it accurate, and is it up to date, and is it meaningful?
Well, I think we're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank both of you for being with us today. Again, everyone, our speakers today were Richard Steinberg. He's founder and CEO of Steinberg Governance Advisors, and John Kelly, Worldwide Market Segment Manager for Risk Analytics at IBM. And also a special thanks to IBM for making this webcast possible. A couple notes here. The webcast has been recorded, so it'll be available sometime in the next day or two on our website at complianceweek.com. CPE credit is also available for our archive webcasts, so check out our on-demand library for additional CPE credits. That's under the webcast tab on our website. To obtain your CPE credit after this presentation, wait until I finish this wrap-up, and at that point the webcast will close automatically and a final exam will be presented in a separate window. You might want to disable your pop-up blockers. I know those have been known to interfere with the test. If you have any trouble viewing the CPE test or getting the CPE certificate, send an email to info@complianceweek.com to request a copy. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This concludes our webcast. Have a very good afternoon. Thank you.